Agradecemos ao senhor Martin Romer e ao senhor Mike Jennings por las palavras de bienvenida. E agora temos o honor de apresentar a senhora MaryMetcalfe. A senhora Mary é uma professora que trabalha em la enseñanza desde 1974. Em 1994, a professora Metcalfe foi nombrada ministra de Educação e em 1999 foi nombrada ministra de Agricultura, Conservação, Meio Ambiente e Terra. A professora Metcalfe foi diretora da Faculdade de Magistério da Universidade Wits, Sudáfrica, desde 2004 e nombrada diretora-geral do Departamento de Educação Superior e Formação em 2009. Asimismo, trabalhou em el Banco de Desenvolvimento de Sudáfrica desde 2011 hasta 2013. Foi e é colaboradora visitante em la Universidade de Joanesburgo e professora visitante adjunta de Wits. Asimismo, é presidenta do Conselho Consultivo de Educação da Open Society Foundation. Temos o honor de ouvir-la em nossa segunda conferência. Bem-vinda.
Good morning. It's a great, there's a sign here that says don't touch the microphones, and it's the first thing I did. Apologies. It's a great honor to be here. I so enjoyed yesterday. The privilege of being with so many strong women was just fantastic. So thank you to EI for inviting me and for such an excellent program. When I was asked to fill the space in the program, I started where probably many of us would, which was to download about 6 books, blump, into my computer and start reading. And then I reread my briefing notes that were kindly sent to me. And what I was advised to do is to start with the personal. I think that much of what you read in the literature, we were reminded of this morning by Martin. All of those appalling statistics of the status of women. Now, I'm not sure where to point this, but I'll point an aha. So what I decided to do was to do very much a personal reflection, to talk about some of the moments that have really shaped my thinking and have shaped my passion as an educator and have shaped my activism in a way. So if we start with the personal, I'm going to start with a meeting I attended. I think it was probably 2 Saturdays ago in Cape Town. It was a meeting of a board of trustees of a very important NGO that gives a lot of money in South Africa. And when I accepted the invitation to sit on the trust several years ago, one of the reasons I did is because there were several people on the committee that I hadn't previously worked with who I really admired. Real leaders in South African education, particularly in higher education. But the meeting, this particular meeting, was a real wake-up call to me, because what happened to me will resonate with all of you. I've been to meetings over about 3 years. But they were, right from the beginning of the meeting, every time I wanted to speak, I was putting my hand up. The men were just talking to each other. And at the end of the table, I was trying to put up my hand, and then I decided to be more assertive, and I too tried to interrupt. And I was just flabbergasted and reminded that even in situations where you think as a woman you now belong and you are now welcomed, your status as a woman marginalizes you. And the woman I was sitting next to, who's a good colleague, we decided that in the next meeting we're going to get out of the ghetto at the end of the table, we're going to sit opposite the chair, and we are going to enter the game differently. But it was a very good wake-up call for me, because it made me very aware of my privilege in the circles, politically, personally, in which I move, where I don't have to fight for that space. I take it for granted. And I felt a little ashamed that I forget that I stand on the shoulders of many giants, some of them in this room, and I begin to take for granted the privileges of the gender equity and equality, such as it is, that we do enjoy. It also reminded me that with that status, there's many women battling at different levels who don't have the same privilege as me, and whose struggles and whose battles are different. And we know that very well because it's related to class, that women working at different levels in society are struggling with gender issues that are deeply related to both status and class. And it took me back to a conversation in the 1980s that I had with a fellow white woman, South African activist in the years of the anti-apartheid struggle. And we were talking about issues to do with gender in South Africa. And she said something that was so striking to me that I can still remember exactly where I was when she said it. She said, "Mary, but you must remember that in South Africa, as white women in the struggle, we are honorary men." And I thought, phew, that is a real moment of understanding the intersections of other components of this matrix. That race and class and status all conspire to position women very differently. And the struggles that we each have to be understood within that context, and there are other components of the context. The one that I was struggling with a little bit yesterday, Monique and I had a very interesting debate after the afternoon workshops, was the issue of culture. And some of the and I'm not sure if all of this has to do with culture, but some of the debates that happened in the workshop around some components of rights, whether those rights were LGTB rights, gender rights, whatever they might be. And it just reminded me that when we've achieved a right, we regard it as self-evident, and therefore it must be the case that it's universal, whereas in fact those rights are won on the ground through struggle. And it's not possible to just say, in our context, we've won this right, therefore it follows that in your context it must be the case too. And the more I thought about it, there's so many components of that right, in terms of faith community, in terms of language, in terms of location, in terms of time. The commission I was in the morning, I found it fascinating, the different positions in relation to quotas. And it was not because they were necessarily right or wrong. They belonged to a different time and a different space. And some strategies are correct for particular spaces and time, and other strategies are correct for other people. So that led me then to say maybe what is very important is to understand that struggles are not the same. In the New York Times on Sunday, there was this remarkable photo that I couldn't resist using because it is such a profound photograph. It's very small, but you may be able to see it. And the particular struggles of that human being, who I presume to be a woman, is nothing like the struggles that any of us face. Nothing like it. And what that means is that we need to be able to start looking at the particular locations of ourselves, of our members, of our colleagues, of the people we seek to serve, and to understand the contexts of people's struggles. I wish that I could have drawn a jigsaw with my PowerPoint, because in a way, one needs to be able to understand the struggles within a particular place as being a jigsaw piece in an intersecting set where everything is nice and smooth and society is working, but as soon as this piece doesn't fit anymore, it creates huge disruption. And that disruption is very important because not only is it political, but it's also personal. When you've learned to behave in the smooth way that fits into the square and you start to push back, it's very uncomfortable. And that's where I think we need to have the power of colleagues and comrades and friends such as this, remembering that fantastic line that came from one of the commissions yesterday: if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Because the pushback in terms of your own self-esteem and your self-concept and how it is that you must behave that comes from the grid is very important. The second thing that's important to me is that the way that we understand the individual contexts and the individual challenges and the contextual situation of that does have implications for strategy, for tactics. And it definitely, as somebody said in the opening panel yesterday, means that we need mechanisms and enablers. But they're multiple, they will vary across context, they will vary across continents, they'll vary across class, race, etc. Which led me then to ask a question I thought was very important for me, which is, who knows best? And in asking the question, who knows best, it seems to me that we need to listen a great deal more. Yesterday there was a lot of discussion about education and workshops, etc., and certainly that's a strategy. But it's not about educating people who are in different spaces. It's about listening to them and to make sure that those experiences are the ones that inform the strategy, because our struggles are not the same. So yesterday was a fantastic day. It was Women in Leadership and Trade Unions. There were 6 workshops. I loved being in all of the ones I was able to be in and to listen. And I think that in terms of this remarkable event where we're listening to each other and people from different continents with different struggles, we need to acknowledge the work of EI in this fantastic conference. For today, there's another 6 commissions, and the theme is an equitable education for an equitable world. And my responsibility is to give this plenary keynote. And I've decided to come to it from something that is important to me. And as I said earlier, kind of defines the way I've lived my life, which is, can education be an instrument of social change? Now, if you were listening to that long CV in the beginning, you might have noticed that this is my 40th year in education. I certainly wasn't invited to breakfast this morning. When I started as an unqualified teacher in 1974 and trained after that. And in my first teacher certificate that I did, I came across the work of Basil Bernstein. He's still very important theoretically, but just the title of his very famous article had a profound effect on me. His article, I think, in New Society in 1970 said, education cannot compensate for society. Now, it was such an important concept for me, because not that I took it as a negative thing, therefore there's no point, but because it helped me to understand that the limitations of my education, you know, the privileged little bubble that I grew up in Africa, is that the impact of the social in terms of what happens in the classroom is considerable. And to what extent can education deal with that has been a question that stayed with me. I wasn't familiar in the 1970s with the work of the Coleman Report, but in 1966 there was this very important publication. It was a study commissioned by the US government on equality of education opportunity. And it's been extremely controversial because he came to the conclusion that the inequalities imposed on children by their home, by their neighborhood, by their peer groups, are carried along, and they carry that inequality with them forever. Now, it might sound to you as if I'm starting off with saying, well, there's no point. But I clearly don't believe that. And even in the Coleman report, there's 3 very important statements that I think have defined, as it happens, although I hadn't read then, is firstly, he said something that is very important to me. It's for the most disadvantaged children that improvements in school quality will make the most difference in achievement. That I believe, and that's what I hold on to every day, because education does matter. The second thing that I think would unite all of us in this room is that it's investments in upgrading teacher quality that will have the most effective achievement in underprivileged areas. Okay, he's using the 1960s language of underprivileged and privileged. But actually, if you want to make the most difference to the poorest children, it's education and the quality of teachers in particular that we need to address. And the third thing that he said that's embedded, I've only got half a sentence of it here, is that the third thing that makes a difference is the extent to which an individual feels that they have control over their destiny, and therefore the critical importance of individual agency. So that was 40 years ago. And where are we now? Where are we if Bernstein was saying that, if Coleman was saying that? And maybe a good place to start is with PISA. Now, I don't know if you can read, but I'll interpret, because it's not a good cut and paste. But PISA, everybody knows, is the international comparative study that is done by the OECD. And what you can see up there does is it shows you how children perform in terms of PISA points, with 600 being the best for Singapore, with the children of professionals and managers performing much better than children whose parents are employed in elementary occupations. So you've got a kind of status grid. You've got a class grid. I'm not sure what other kind of cultural grids. I'm not sure about what kind of gender grid is in there. But there it is, 40 years on. But what's very interesting is that Open Society Foundations does a postdoc scholarship for people to work within the OECD looking at issues related to inequality. And one of those students presented a paper 2 weeks ago in CIS in Canada, which did this. It looked at the United Kingdom and did a comparison. Now, there's 2 conclusions here. One is that the class repetition in terms of the hierarchy of privilege is as true in United Kingdom as it is in Singapore. There's pretty much straight lines with one notch down. But what this young researcher showed, which I think is very interesting, is that education does matter, because children of factory workers in Singapore outperform children of professionals in the UK. So that was his thesis. Education does still matter, class does still matter, but we have these massive inequalities. So what does it mean for education post-2015? And some of the commissions today, we're going to be looking at that. And we need to ask, can education be an instrument of social change? So in this era of all of the post-2015 debates, there's some very important publications. I looked on the ILO website, and they had posted the United Nations Development Survey report on the world we want, growth and employment post-2015, and clearly what they want is an equitable world which is part of the theme for today's work. This is what they have to say, and the first statement is very important. Widening inequalities in the world not only affect the poor and marginalized populations, but they are corrosive for society as a whole. Now, I'm sure many of you will have read The Spirit Level. If you haven't, it's a very good read, because it's just such a persuasive argument about how inequalities undermine all people within a society, not just the poor. The second thing that they argue for is that in order to have an equitable world, in order to address these inequalities that are bad for all of us, we need a focus on equality of growth that is inclusive, equality of growth that generates decent jobs and which reduces income inequalities. But now, coming back to us in the room today, they say that an equitable world requires an equitable education, and that education has been a great disappointment. I think at two levels in this statement. There's widespread deficits. So these are not the educationists speaking, these are the economists. The economists are saying about our work that there's widespread deficits, quality, relevance, equity. It goes on to make a statement that we won't have time to talk about today, but it's a very important one for me, is that the simple correlation between education and employment doesn't hold where you have economies that are not labor absorbing. And we need to think about what that means for education. What does it mean for gender in education? Well, then I went to the Global Monitoring Report published a month or so ago in Cairo. And there's a very interesting graph there. What this graph does is it looks at achievement of gender parity. Now, I know you may not be able to read it, so let me read it for you. What you can see there are 3 bars. The one on the left is primary schooling, the one in the middle is lower secondary, and the one on the right is upper secondary. And they've taken a tack that I like very much, is that they've looked at disparity. Where there's parities, it's the bright pink. Where there's disparity at the expense of girls, it's the pale yellow. But they're also looking at disparities in terms of boys, which is a growing issue in the literature and a growing issue in our lives. And it reminded me that men are part of the solution. I was very pleased with what Mike was saying. Often in context in South Africa, I kind of wait before a meeting until people are waiting. Why am I waiting? Why am I waiting? Why am I waiting? And then I say, no, I'm just waiting for the woman. Here, one could say we're waiting for the men. But men need to be part of the solution. So that is for high-income countries. The next set of graphs is for upper middle-income countries. And the last graphs there are for lower and middle-income countries. And you can see that parity recedes with poverty. There's many other conclusions. There it is in the Global Monitoring Report. You can have a look at it. The important conclusion from that is that the Global Monitoring Report on Education for All says that by 2015, we are not going to get gender parity in primary schools in 41% of countries and in secondary schools in 55% of countries. And we have to remember that those inequalities also exist within countries. So a country can look good, but the inequalities within are profound. So where that leaves us is to work together to understand more deeply why it is that EI, in its work, in working for 2015, has formulated the particular goals that they're negotiating for. It's important for us to understand that, because EI can only achieve these goals if in all of the countries in which we operate, we're mobilizing for significant stakeholders, civil society and government, to support these goals. And the goal for 2030 is that every child, no reference to boy and girl because it's assumed, and that's a victory in itself, must complete a full cycle of continuous, free, quality, early childhood, primary, lower and upper secondary education. It's a huge advance on Dakar. It's making secondary education something that we all are committed to. And it's moving for beyond 2030 to the vocational, to the post-school, to the university, which is also a commission today. So if that's a quick wrap-up of some of the thinking in my life, this is my conclusion. I think education can compensate for society, and it must do so, but we need to do some qualifications. Firstly, it's an equitable education which reaches out to the most marginalized and makes adjustments in the resources so that they focus to the needy. It has to be a quality education that nurtures critical thinking. My colleague, Hugh McLean, who's the director of the Education Support Program in ESF, has this wonderful phrase where he talks about it's a reaction to the push from many of the corporates driving their own agenda in this debate, where they just want narrow reading, what are the reading scores? He says it's not just reading the word, it's reading the world. A critical perspective on the world is what we want. So we can have education compensating for society if it's equitable, if it's quality, if it nurtures critical thinking. But it must also be embedded in a broader struggle and organization for social justice. I was very taken by what Helder said yesterday, and I want to come to that. But I believe that as educators, the more we are able to provide an equitable and quality education that nurtures critical thinking, the more we are able to contribute to the struggle for social justice. And the more the struggle for social justice succeeds, the more we are able to do our work. It's completely embedded. Now, Hulda said yesterday, I cannot do it on my own. When she got up and acknowledged the role of people in her life who've enabled her to grow as a union activist, that's true of all of us. But it's also true of the education union strand within the broader struggle, that it's education unions working with other organizations in society that will help us to achieve what we must, which is the equitable quality education for all that nurtures critical thinking, understanding that it happens in a social context, which is why I think the EI campaign for a better education, for a better world is so important and so profound. So moving from words to action, I agreed with Monique that where we go from here, from words to action, is to start looking at the mechanisms and the enablers that take us from our individual contexts to be able to increase participation of girls around the world, deepen the participation of women in higher education, etc. So, thank you very much.
No hay palabras para agradecer por esta intervención, pero a nombre de la Internacional de la Educación nos gustaría de pasarte un regalo como un recuerdo de su participación tan brillante en nuestra segunda conferencia. Gracias.